I remember the moment I stopped being someone. It didn't come with a sword or a scream, only with a rope, tied loosely, then tightly around my wrists until I couldn't feel where my hands ended and the will of another man began. There wasn't a declaration. No one said, "You're property now." That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, they pulled me forward, and that's how it started. The sun was already high, too high, burning down from a sky so blue it almost mocked me. We were in the outskirts of what I would later learn was Capua. At the time, I only knew the dust, the calloused hands around me, and the rhythmic crunch of feet on gravel as we were herded like cattle. Some wept, some prayed. I didn't do either. I just looked at the man walking in front of me and wondered if he was still himself inside that broken posture. You wouldn't have survived this part, not because of the hunger, not because of the pain, but because of the silence. No one spoke. Not the guards, not the chained, not the gods we had all been taught to fear. It wasn't the kind of silence that soothes. It was the kind that empties you, makes your breath shallow and your thoughts small enough to carry without breaking. When we arrived at the market, there were no crowds cheering, no speeches, just buyers, wealthy, sunburnt, half-interested, walking between bodies as if inspecting fruit. They poked, they prodded, they tapped teeth. They asked questions about strength and obedience, but never once used the word person. That was the worst part. You could endure being sold, but not being invisible while it happened. They made me stand on a block, not high, just high enough that I could see over the heads of the men who would decide where I lived, what I ate, and how long I might survive. I thought of running, just for a moment. Not because I believed I'd escape, but because I wanted to remind myself that I still could choose something, even if it was just the direction I died in. You wouldn't have lasted here, because this was the part where your old name stopped working. No one calls you what your mother called you. No one wants to know what dreams you had. They assign you something short, convenient. I became Service. Later, Atticus. Once, boy. Never again myself. They oiled my skin before the auction. It was standard, I would learn. It made the muscles look better, hid the bruises, masked the thinness from travel. I stood still as a man turned my head left and right, checking my teeth. He complimented my posture. Not to me, to the buyer behind him. I was no longer being addressed, only displayed. When the bidding started, I couldn't hear the numbers, only the tone. Some voices were bored, others annoyed. A few were amused. The one that won was calm. Too calm. Later, they marked my arm with ink and ash. A brand, they called it. So I wouldn't get lost. As if the chain wasn't enough. As if the shame hadn't already written itself across my spine. They asked if I understood Latin. I didn't answer, but I listened. I listened as the man who bought me said, "He looks young, strong. Probably won't last the year, though." Another man laughed. I didn't. Not then. Not ever again. That was my first day as a slave. The first day of many. The first layer of a long forgetting. The villa was carved into the hillside like a wound that refused to heal. Wide, white, and exposed to the cruel Roman sun. From a distance, it looked serene, like a painting meant to depict order. But the closer we drew, the more the cracks bled through. The marble steps were chipped from too many sandals. The statues had bird droppings on their heads. And the silence was not one of peace, but of domination. They led me through the side gate, not the front. Slaves don't enter through thresholds meant for citizens. That archway, ornate and flanked with columns, was for men with names, for women in fine tunics, for guests who brought gifts. My world would not include arches. It would include thresholds of stone, dirt, and orders whispered through clenched teeth. The first thing you would have noticed, if you'd still had the clarity to notice anything, was the smell. Not rot, though that would come later. No, it was olive oil and sweat, animal hides and crushed herbs, a scent both domestic and violent, the smell of a household that runs on labor, stolen through silence. They didn't tell me where to go. They didn't have to. The other slaves knew. And I followed the fear on their backs. A man, taller than most, with a scar across his cheek like a knife, had once forgotten him mid-murder, shoved a folded tunic into my arms. He said, "Put it on." Not kindly, not cruelly. Just like I was part of the furniture being adjusted. The tunic was scratchy, too short, too clean, as if it had once belonged to someone who no longer needed it. I didn't ask where he had gone. You wouldn't have, either. You learn quickly that questions only buy you pain. They brought me to the back courtyard. There the dominus stood. He wasn't tall. He wasn't cruel-looking. He wasn't anything I expected. And that was worse. Because cruelty can be seen coming. He was smiling, calmly, his sandals too clean, his rings too loud against the soft clap of his hands. And when he spoke, it was like someone humming a tune they didn't remember learning. "You'll clean the pool," he said. "The bottom, with your hands. No tools." I looked at the pool. It was shallow, mostly dry, lined with algae and pebbles as though time itself had decided to start reclaiming it. "No talking," the scarred man said. He said it, like you say, "Good morning." And so, I climbed in. Your knees would have hurt by the third scrape of stone against skin. Your fingernails would have cracked from peeling moss. Your pride, if you still carried any, would have buckled faster than your back. But it wasn't the pain that taught me something new. It was the fact that no one watched. You imagine slaves being supervised, but often you're simply left to disappear. I scrubbed until I forgot why I was scrubbing. I cleaned until the word clean meant nothing. And somewhere between the 4th blister and the 10th hour, I realized no one would tell me when I'd done enough, because enough didn't exist. The master returned when the sun began to dip. He peered down into the pool like a man inspecting a reflection of himself. Not in water, but in the man laboring at the bottom. "You missed a spot," he said. It wasn't criticism, it was declaration, a reminder that I was still new, still unbroken, still full of too much self. And then he said nothing more. He turned, and he left. When the stars came out, they didn't offer beauty, only coldness, only quiet. The first command I received was not a task. It was a statement. You belong to someone else now, and your body no longer speaks for you. I was woken not by a voice, but by the unmistakable scent of smoke, sharp, biting, and thick with ash. It clung to everything, from the worn linen mat where I slept to the inside of my nostrils. The others were already moving, shadows in the half-light, drifting like ghosts toward the back of the villa. No one spoke. Words were a currency too expensive to spend at this hour. They didn't tell me where to go, but I knew. The same way a hunted animal knows which direction means survival. I followed the trail of smoke and the quiet rhythm of bare feet until I reached it, the kitchen. Or rather, something that had once been a kitchen. before the years and the soot had made it something else entirely. It was a separate structure behind the main house, made of stone blackened by decades of fire, with no windows to the front and no doors that closed all the way. It didn't welcome you in. It consumed you. Inside, it was already alive. Fire cracked in the central pit, where pots the size of barrels steamed and hissed. Wooden beams groaned under the weight of hanging herbs and carcasses. A thick slab of stone, worn smooth from years of use, served as the chopping block, though its stains ran deeper than any cut. The first lesson you learn in the kitchen is not about food, it's about order. And in this place, order didn't come from instructions. It came from motion, from watching, from not getting in the way. There were no rosters, no assignments, only the rhythm. And it had to be learned fast, or it would crush you like a stone wheel rolling downhill. The cook was a woman named Livia, or at least that's what others called her. She was tall, with forearms like braided rope, and hands as dark as fired clay. Her face bore no softness, just lines etched deep like old battle scars. She didn't speak for the first few days, didn't acknowledge me at all. When she finally did, it was with a sharp gesture. She handed me a dull knife and a basket of onions. "If you cry too loud," she muttered, "I'll toss you in the stew." She wasn't joking, but she wasn't cruel either, just efficient. Like the fires, like the knives, like the silence. You might think kitchens are places of comfort, warmth, nourishment. You'd be wrong. Here the smells were intoxicating. Fresh bread, roasting meat, herbs crushed underfoot. But none of it was for us. We prepared it, yes. Stirred it, salted it, tasted it sometimes on the edge of a fingertip. But we didn't eat. Not unless something was burned, dropped, or spoiled. And even then, it had to be claimed in secret. Hunger became a constant hum in the blood. Not sharp enough to scream, but loud enough to drown out anything else. There was a hierarchy among us, even in starvation. New ones like me peeled vegetables and scrubbed soot from the walls. Older slaves managed the stews, sliced meats, arranged plates for the triclinium. Livia ran everything, without ever raising her voice. Just one glance from her could reroute 5 people at once. A tilt of her head meant you'd missed a spot. A flick of her finger meant clean it again properly. Once, I saw a boy drop a slice of roasted fig on the floor. He glanced around, picked it up, and popped it into his mouth. A mistake. Livia saw him, of course. She didn't strike him. She didn't yell. She walked over slowly, took another fig from the tray, and pressed it into his mouth until juice spilled down his chin. Then she whispered something no one else could hear. Whatever it was, the boy didn't return the next day. At midday, the house bell rang. 3 tones, slow and heavy. The master was ready to eat. That was when the silence shattered. Trays were lifted, platters arranged, goblets polished until they reflected the ceiling. Every piece of food was perfect, because if it wasn't, someone bled. We watched the servants carry it all away, our stomachs tightening with every step. Then we waited. Waited to clean up. Waited to scrape the bones. Waited to fight over a burned corner of crust, like dogs around a carcass. You wouldn't have survived this. Not because of the pain, but because of the invisibility. Because you'd remember who you used to be. What it was like to eat when you were hungry. What it was like to be thanked. Here, there were no names. No gratitude. Only the rhythm. And if you fell out of step, you were discarded like spoiled meat. At the end of my first week, Livia dropped a fish spine into my bowl. barely any meat left on it. I ate it slowly, not for the food, but for what it meant. A signal. You've endured this long. Now let's see if you last longer. Outside, the sun baked the villa's walls white. Inside, the kitchen burned on, its heat fed by wood, sweat, and obedience. And I, a nameless hand among many, learned to keep moving, to stay quiet, and to swallow more than just hunger. I had just begun to understand the rhythm of the kitchen, its unspoken codes, its brutal clarity, when I was pulled from it without explanation. No words, just a gesture. A sharp nod from the overseer, who always smelled faintly of metal and sweat. I followed him through the long back corridor, past the olive press and tool shed, until the sound of the estate began to shift. It was quiet where we were going. Too quiet. Not the silence of night or solitude, but that dense, swollen stillness that fills the air before something terrible begins. The trees thinned, the stone path turned to dust, and then I saw it. The arena. It wasn't the great Colosseum, of course, not marble and gold and roaring multitudes. This was private, modest in scale, but heavy with intent. A sunken oval carved into the earth, its borders lined with low limestone walls, shaded awnings of faded red, and wooden benches built not for comfort, but for the pleasure of watching others suffer. The arena was a pit, not just in shape, but in spirit. And once you stepped into it, you weren't meant to come out the same. That day was the 13th birthday of the master's son, a boy barely older than I was, dressed in bright blue, with hair that curled like a crown. He sat beneath a canopy flanked by tutors and attendants, his eyes flicking restlessly toward the pit like a lion cub eager to taste blood. I was handed a broom, not a weapon, not a message, just a broom. My job, it seemed, was to sweep the sand, to make it clean, to prepare it for the spectacle to come. No one told me what that would be, but I could feel it, buzzing beneath the surface like thunder inside stone. You wouldn't have survived this part, because this was not labor you could rationalize, not hunger you could quiet. This was waiting for violence, watching it grow like a shadow until it swallowed the sky. Guests arrived slowly, with laughter like clinking goblets, silks rustled, perfumed sleeves brushed against stone. Servants bowed, offering grapes and sweetened wine. No one looked at me as I swept. To them, I was not a boy. I was not even present. The sand needed to be smooth, they said. Fresh. That word again. As if suffering required neatness. As if blood needed a proper canvas. When the horn sounded, the first pair of slaves were led into the ring. They were boys. One of them I knew. He had once shared a scrap of bread with me behind the granary long ago, when our stomachs spoke louder than our mouths. Now, he was shirtless, barefoot, eyes blank. Each of them held a wooden rod, one smooth and one splintered. There were no helmets, no armor, no chance. The crowd leaned forward. The boy in blue popped a fig into his mouth and waited. Then someone shouted, "Begin." The first strike landed awkwardly, more dust than pain. The second tore skin. The third brought laughter from the benches. You wouldn't have survived this, not because of the gore, but because of the silence it demanded from us. No one screamed, no one cried out, even as splinters embedded in flesh, as eyes swelled shut, mouths remained closed, because pain was allowed, but sound was not. The match ended when one boy collapsed, not unconscious, but unwilling. He was dragged out like a sack of grain. The winner, if such a word could apply, was patted in the shoulder, handed a cup of water, and then escorted back into the shadows. There was no reward, no mercy, just rotation. The next pair entered, and the rhythm began again. For hours I swept, not between matches, during them. My broom smoothed blood into the sand as if I were erasing names from stone. I did not look at the faces. I did not look at the crowd. I watched the broom. At one point, a young girl vomited in the front row. Her mother laughed and covered her eyes. Another guest clapped with every strike, as if it were music. By dusk, the sand was no longer golden. It had turned rust red, and the breeze carried the smell of copper and wine. And when the final horn blew, and the sun slipped behind the cypress trees, I was still there, broom in hand, sweeping the remains of a day no one would speak of tomorrow. No one except us. You wouldn't have survived this, because even if your body endured the hours, your soul might not have. You'd remember the face of that boy, his lip trembling before the first blow. You'd remember the fig in the master's son's fingers. You'd remember the sound of the crowd, joyful, full, at the breaking of something soft. That night, I returned to the slave quarters with shaking legs, but not from fear, from restraint, from the effort of not reacting, of learning fully and finally that we were not people to them. We were stage props, canvas, flesh in motion. And as I lay on the floor, too tired to close my eyes, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. Tomorrow, they'd ask me to sweep again. And I would. I hadn't even realized there was a part of the villa I hadn't seen. You think, after enough days spent moving from one corner of stone to another, that you know every crack in the floor and every flicker of oil light on the walls. But there was always more. More silence. More stairs. More places where someone like me wasn't supposed to go. That morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the tiled roof, Livia handed me a tray. Not the kind of tray I was used to. This one was polished silver, not wood, and it held a single goblet and 2 figs so perfectly round and dark, they might have been made of marble. No explanation. Just a nod toward the far hallway, the one with the green curtain that was usually tied shut. Behind it, a narrow stone stairwell that curved downward, carved straight into the earth like a wound. No torch, no sound, just cool, damp air, and the steady drip of water from some place I couldn't see. I descended with the tray balanced carefully in both hands, every step feeling like a question no one would answer. You wouldn't have survived this part. Not because it was violent, but because it was quiet in a way that makes your thoughts too loud. At the bottom of the stairs, the hallway opened into a corridor lined with smooth walls and flickering lamplight. The stone was darker here, older somehow, etched faintly with patterns I didn't recognize. Curved lines, scratched grooves, marks that looked like writing, but not in any language I'd ever seen on a scroll. The room itself was rectangular, bare, except for a table, a chair, and a single man seated there with his back turned to me. He didn't look like the others in the household. He wore no toga, no jewels, just a long dark robe that blended into the shadows. He didn't acknowledge me when I entered, didn't turn. I waited. Then he spoke. His voice was thin, not weak but brittle, like old parchment rubbed too many times between the fingers. "You've seen the arena," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. He still hadn't turned around. But I nodded, unsure if he could even see me. "You've swept the blood, smelled the metal." Another pause. "Do you know why we spill it?" I didn't know if I was meant to answer, but he wasn't really waiting for one. "We spill it because we must. because memory fades and blood remembers. Then he gestured to the wall in front of him. I stepped closer and saw it wasn't bare. It was covered in scratches. Thousands of tiny marks, each about the length of a fingernail, layered over one another like scales on a serpent. Some had been carved with metal, some with bone, some perhaps with nothing but fingernails and time. These, he said, are the names of those who remember. He turned then, just slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, sunken, eyes like smoke over dying coals. Your name will join them, he said. Not yet, but eventually. All names come here. He raised one finger, long and knotted, and pointed to a blank space at the corner of the wall. The tray in my hands trembled slightly, the goblet clinking against the silver. You don't think you belong here, he said, though I had said nothing. But you do. You will. You already do. You wouldn't have survived this, because in that moment I felt something slip, not from my hands, but from my sense of what was real. A room beneath the earth. A man who knew my path without asking. A wall of scratches that told the truth better than parchment ever could. I left the tray where it was. He didn't drink, didn't eat. I climbed the stairs back into the light, but something stayed behind. A weight in the chest. A whisper in the ear that didn't fade even when the birds began to sing. From that day forward, I passed the green curtain differently. Not with fear, but with the quiet knowledge that beneath every villa, every temple, every statue that reaches up to the sun, there is always a shadow that reaches just as far downward. And in that shadow, someone remembers your name, even if you no longer do. It wasn't the first time I'd been displayed, but it was the first time I understood it. They woke us before the sun, before the birds had begun their half-hearted morning calls, and led us to the bathhouse. Not for our sake, of course, but for theirs. Clean flesh sells better than filthy. Even bruises look less offensive when rinsed under warm water and wrapped in fine linen. We were being polished like furniture, prepared like meat. You wouldn't have survived this part, because the auction wasn't just about standing still. It was about disappearing, slowly, deliberately, until only your body remained. They made us stand in a row. 6 of us. Different shapes, different shades, different reasons for being there. Some had been caught stealing. Some were debtors. Some, like me, were simply born into it. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was posture and silence. And the way we held our shoulders as the buyers began to circle. They didn't call them buyers, of course. They used words like patrons, clients, collectors, as if this were art, as if we were something worth appreciating. One man pinched the muscle in my arm. Another examined my teeth. A woman traced a scar along my shoulder and asked how I got it. I lied and said I didn't remember. She smiled. Good, she whispered. Memory is a flaw. You wouldn't have survived this because you might have spoken. You might have screamed or cried or tried to run. But there's nowhere to run on an auction block. Only up, or down, or out, through the mouths of those who believe they own you. The slave master stood beside us, calling out attributes like a merchant at a market stall. Healthy male, 14 years, good lungs. Obedient, minor scarring, no disfigurement. I wasn't a boy to him. I was a list of qualities, a ledger entry with teeth. I watched as the others were led away one by one. The girl with the limp was sold first. Not for labor, they said, but for her voice. She sang once for a senator's wife, and now she belonged to a man who wanted lullabies more than conversation. The tall boy went to a blacksmith. The twins, silent, wide-eyed, always holding hands, were purchased by a spice merchant with teeth stained red from wine. And then it was my turn. You wouldn't have survived this, because the moment they call your name, not the one you were born with, but the one they gave you, something breaks. Not all at once, not loudly, just a small inward cracking, like pottery under slow fire. They led me to the center, raised the platform, asked me to turn, to lift my arms, to walk, to kneel. A dozen eyes watched, some curious, some hungry, some bored. A man near the back, dressed in dull blue robes, spoke first. 40 denarii. Another raised a hand. 55. Then the bidding began in earnest. Fast, cold, precise, as if they were arguing over livestock, not life. I stood motionless, heart pounding in my throat, wondering what each number meant. Not in coins, but in fate. Would the 55 denarii man beat me more? Would the 61 denarii woman feed me better? What does 68 denarii buy you in a person? The final bid came from someone I couldn't see. A voice behind the curtain, masked and measured. 80. Silence followed. No one countered. The hammer dropped. Sold. To a man I wouldn't meet until later that night. You wouldn't have survived this, because when they lead you off that platform, you don't walk as yourself anymore. You walk as someone else's property, and every step echoes that truth in your bones. They branded us after sunset. A small room, hot coals, a mark pressed just below the shoulder blade. Not deep, not long, but forever. I didn't scream, not because I was brave, but because the man before me had, and they laughed at him, mocked him. Pain you can handle, humiliation lingers longer. That night, as I lay on a cold floor in a house I didn't know, with strangers breathing beside me, I traced the brand with my fingertips, still hot, still stinging. And I whispered my real name, twice, softly, so I wouldn't forget. But I would forget. Eventually. Because forgetting is safer. Because remembering, in a world that tells you you are nothing, is a kind of rebellion. And rebellion, as I'd already learned, comes with a price. They didn't call it the punishment tree. That was the name we whispered to each other, late at night, when the torches were low and the walls felt like they were listening. To them, it was just the post, or the square, or sometimes nothing at all. Just a gesture, a glance, a tightening of the mouth. But to us, it was a place where time stopped moving forward and instead sank downward like a stone dropped into a well. You wouldn't have survived this. Not because of the pain, but because of the waiting. The punishment tree was not in the forest. It stood in the open courtyard at the center of the estate, between the olive press, the kennels, surrounded by gravel that crunched under bare feet like broken teeth. It was not, strictly speaking, a tree. It was a pillar of dark wood, cracked from years of sun and salt, ringed with old iron loops and ropes that smelled of mildew and sweat and fear. They tied us there in the morning, not always to beat us, sometimes just to leave us, to let the day burn us from above, and the ground leach our strength from below. That was a punishment in itself, to be seen and not spoken to be made into a warning rather than a person, to be turned into a display. My first time came after I dropped a pitcher in the atrium. A simple accident, a wet tile, a slip. The shards scattered like tiny stars across the marble, and the red wine bled outward in slow, lazy tendrils that made it look as though the floor itself had opened a vein. No one was hurt, but I was. The steward said nothing. He didn't need to. He just pointed, and I walked. Because that's what you do. Because there are no refusals when the punishment isn't about justice, but order. They didn't tie my arms tight. They didn't need to. Shame does the job of chains better than iron. I stood there as the sun rose, and the flies found me, and the kitchen boys laughed as they passed on their way to the stables. And the worst part was that I began to believe it, that I deserved it, that I was the mistake, that the spilled wine wasn't the accident. I was. You wouldn't have survived this, because you still believe in fairness, because you think punishment should come after guilt, not before it. But in Rome, the hierarchy was the justice. Your birth determined your weight, and anything that broke from that was considered rebellion. I saw others tied there too. A girl who spoke too loudly, a man who refused to kneel, a boy who cried at night, each one left with something less than they arrived with. Not fingers or flesh, but dignity. And that loss, that quiet crumbling of self, it stayed with you. Long after the rope was untied and the bruises faded. One afternoon, I saw a nobleman's son strike his tutor with a bronze stylus. The man bled. The boy laughed. No punishment came. But later that week, the same tutor brushed past me too quickly in the corridor, and I dropped the scrolls I was holding. He flinched, apologized, and I comforted him, because I understood you wouldn't have survived this, because the punishment tree isn't just a place, it's a lesson, a message carved invisibly into the daily rhythm of a life lived beneath another's will. It says, don't stand out, don't speak back, don't stumble, and if you do, smile through it, bow lower, whisper apologies for things you didn't choose. Years later, I passed that same post as a man, not free, not owned, just older. And I touched it, briefly, silently. It was rough, still warm from the sun, still stained from a time no one else remembered. Except me. Because there are wounds that don't leave scars. They live in posture, in silence, in the way your hands flinch when a voice rises too quickly. They live in how you breathe. And some days, even now, I find myself holding that breath without knowing why. There was a moment every morning, just before the embers were stirred and the kitchen roared back to life, when I could almost believe I was alone. Not free, but alone. And that was something. The kitchen was a world of its own, a realm of smoke and heat and metal, where time was measured not in hours or days, but in meals. Breakfast for the overseers, lunch for the guards, dinner for the masters. And for us, the scraps. If they remembered, if we behaved. You wouldn't have survived this. Not because you can't cook, but because you think cooking is about choice. Here, it was about obedience, precision, repetition, every motion rehearsed, every spice carefully measured, every dish plated to standards set by people who had never chopped an onion, never burned their hands on boiling oil, never gone to sleep hungry beside the smell of roasted meat. The kitchen had its hierarchy, just like the estate. There were senior cooks, usually Greek or North African, who had once served in noble houses. They knew the difference between patrician and plebeian palates. They could fold honey into goat cheese like silk and prepare pheasant that melted on the tongue. And then there were the rest of us, the grinders, the stirrers, the invisible hands. I was one of those. I stirred things, endlessly. Bread porridge, boiling wine, stews that turned into paste, gruels that smelled of damp cloth and despair. You wouldn't have survived this, because you'd ask why. Why must I stir counterclockwise? Why must the pot simmer for precisely 100 beats of the heart? Why must I stop breathing every time the master's food is carried past? But there are no whys in the kitchen, only how fast, how quiet, how clean. There was a boy once. He asked why. Only once. He was new. Bright eyes, fast hands. He reached for salt when he should have waited. The overseer didn't raise his voice. He just reached into the fire and pulled out the iron brand. It hissed in the oil. The boy didn't scream. Not at first. But he never asked again. And neither did we. The hardest part wasn't the heat or the noise or the endless aching in the back. It was the hunger. To cook food you couldn't eat. To roast lamb soaked in wine, sweetened with figs, and know your meal would be stale barley and a half-ripe olive. To watch others bite, chew, swallow, and keep your mouth shut. Once, I licked a spoon, just a bit of honey that clung to the edge. The head cook saw. He said nothing. But that night, I was left off the meal roll, not punished, just forgotten. And that emptiness stayed with me longer than any beating. You wouldn't have survived this, because you still believe in fairness, in shared labor, meaning shared reward. But in the kitchens of Rome, justice wasn't baked into the bread. It was burned away, scraped off, discarded with the ashes. There was an old woman there. Her name was Tulla. She had no teeth, but her hands moved like poetry. She could dice onions without looking. She could fold leaves into tiny cups that held sauces like secrets. One night, she whispered to me, "I once cooked for the emperor." I didn't ask which one. I just nodded, because the truth wasn't in who she served, but in how far she had fallen, and in the fact that she was still stirring. On the worst days, I imagined slipping a bit of ash into the master's stew, or letting the wine boil too long, or forgetting the herbs entirely. Little rebellions, tiny fractures in the ritual, but I never did. Because I knew how they'd respond, not with words, but with hunger. They would starve me before they struck me. You wouldn't have survived this, because in your world, food is comfort, a gift, a pleasure. Here, it was power. And every grain, every crumb, every breath of steam carried with it the reminder that we were allowed to live, but only as long as we fed those who mattered. Sometimes at night, I still smell the broth, the garlic, the vinegar, the crackling skin, and I remember the quiet sobs of the girl peeling onions in the corner, and the way the fire hissed when someone let their tears fall too close. And I wonder, was the food better because we were hungry? Or because we cooked it with our silence? There was a door at the end of the west corridor, past the marble columns and the faded fresco of Neptune rising from the sea. It was not locked. It didn't need to be. No one told us not to enter. They didn't have to. Because the silence surrounding it was thicker than any chain, heavier than any decree. We called it the Forbidden Room. You wouldn't have survived this. Not because you're curious, but because you'd ask questions. What's inside? Why is it hidden? Who goes in and who never comes out? In Rome, curiosity was a flaw in a slave, a dangerous spark in a house built of dry straw. The first time I passed it, I slowed down, just for a second, enough for the steward to notice. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He simply looked at me, and I felt my skin turn to wax beneath his gaze. After that, I kept my eyes forward, my footsteps light, my thoughts tucked behind my teeth. The room had no window, but sometimes, late at night, you could see a flicker of light beneath the doorframe. Not candlelight, but something duller, colder, like the reflection of silver on wet stone. Once, I thought I heard music, low, distant, like humming, but the kind of humming you don't follow, the kind that leads you into the dark. One morning, Livia disappeared. She had been serving wine the night before, at a banquet where the master entertained guests from the Senate. The next day, her mat was empty, her sandals still by the wall. No one asked, no one mentioned her name, but we all looked at the door, and we knew. You wouldn't have survived this, because silence is foreign to you. You think danger comes with warning signs, that evil shouts and gestures and leaves footprints. But here, it breathes quietly. It hides in the way no one speaks of Livia, in the way footsteps speed up near the west corridor, in the way even the dogs avoid that door. I once carried a tray past it, olives, figs, honey nuts. The handle turned. The door creaked open just an inch. I didn't look. I didn't stop. But for a moment, I felt cold air against my skin, as if something inside had forgotten warmth. Later, I was punished, not for looking, not for asking, but because a single fig had rolled from the tray and stopped at the base of the door. The steward said nothing. He simply placed a mark beside my name in the ledger. And that night, I slept without a blanket. The forbidden room wasn't about what was inside. It was about what it meant. That there are layers to power. That even among slaves there are boundaries. That some knowledge costs more than ignorance can afford. Once, I asked Tulla about it. She looked at me, not sharply, not sadly, just with a quiet resignation, and she said, "Even walls have ears, but that one? It also has a mouth." I never asked again. You wouldn't have survived this, because you believe in answers, in pulling back the curtain, in truth setting you free. But in this world, truth was another tool, another weapon, another punishment waiting to be chosen. Years later, I passed that room again, this time as a ghost of myself, older, quieter, harder to scare. The door was ajar. Inside, nothing. Just shadows. Dust. A mirror leaning against the wall cracked through the center. I looked at myself in that mirror. The boy who had once carried a tray of figs. The man who had learned not to flinch. And I realized the room had never been forbidden. Only the act of imagining a life beyond it. There were no schools for us. No scrolls written with our names in mind. No teachers who cared if we could read the words carved into the marble walls we scrubbed. We weren't supposed to know things. We were supposed to carry things, to clean, to wait, to obey. But sometimes, the mind wanders where the whip cannot reach. You wouldn't have survived this, because you believe that knowledge is always offered, that if a lesson exists, it will find its way to you, printed, labeled, and yours for the taking. But in Rome, if you were born in chains, even a word could be a rebellion. It began with a wax tablet, left behind in the garden after a tutoring session. I remember it clearly. Its surface smooth, the stylus still pressed into the beeswax. The letters were crude, Latin phrases, simple drills. But to me, they were shapes from another world. I stared at it for hours, traced the curves of the letters with my finger, didn't understand a single one. But I felt something stir, a hunger I hadn't known I carried. Tulla noticed. Of course she did. She said nothing at first, but that night, She passed me a piece of coal from the fire. "Practice," she said, then walked away. No scroll, no ink, just ash and stolen moments. I began marking the wall behind the sleeping mats. At first, just lines, then symbols, then letters. Badly formed, uneven, more scratches than script. But they were mine. You wouldn't have survived this, because your learning was a gift. Ours was a risk. Every letter I etched into stone could have cost me a finger. Every night I whispered syllables under my breath. I prayed no one would hear. And yet I couldn't stop, because each word I learned, each phrase I copied from overheard lessons, each fragment of poetry was a reminder that my mind was still my own. There was a slave named Darius, older, quiet, used to polish the master's sandals. No one knew he could read, until the day the master's son dropped a scroll, and Darius caught it upside down. Without thinking, he turned it right. That moment, just that, was enough. By nightfall, he was gone. No explanation, no goodbyes. Just his tools left neatly stacked by the stable door. We knew better than to ask. I never made that mistake. I never let the words leave my mouth when others were near. But inside, they grew. Latin, a little Greek. Enough to understand insults before they landed. Enough to read warnings before they were spoken aloud. Tulla taught me more. She had once served a scholar, she said. Had once copied texts by candlelight while pretending to be illiterate. She taught me to memorize with rhythm, to hide words inside songs, to count verses on my knuckles behind my back. Learning became survival. Not a luxury, not a right, but armor. You wouldn't have survived this, because your world celebrates knowledge. Ours punished it. In your world, books lined shelves in every home. In mine, the only scroll I ever touched was used to light a brazier when the lamps failed. One day, I saw the master burn a pile of letters. He called them trouble. Philosophy, he sneered. I watched the flames, saw the ink twist and vanish, felt the heat on my face. And I thought, if ideas could die in fire, they must be alive. And if they were alive, maybe I could be too. I kept learning, on broken pots, on scraps of wood, with dust on stone floors, drawn with my finger before the wind swept it away. Nothing permanent, nothing that could be used against me. Only thoughts, quiet, stubborn, growing stronger each day. That was the lesson Rome never meant to teach. That the mind, once kindled, cannot be chained. That a slave who knows a single word more than he did yesterday is already halfway free. And so I kept reading, kept writing, in secret, in silence, in smoke. Steam is its own kind of silence. It doesn't hush the world. It distorts it. In the bathhouse, you hear everything, but nothing clearly. Laughter becomes echo. Commands come muffled, disjointed, as if passed through cloth. And that's the point. The bathhouse wasn't just a place to cleanse the skin. It was a theater of shadows, a marketplace of whispers. And if you were a slave in that space, your job wasn't just to serve. It was to disappear. You wouldn't have survived this, because you'd look where you weren't supposed to. You'd speak without permission. You'd exist too loudly. The bathhouse required a different kind of silence, not the quiet of obedience, but the stillness of furniture. I was sent there after I'd grown taller, stronger. Shoulders like an ox, the steward had said. They needed someone to carry wood for the fires, to tend the coals that warmed the water, to hold towels with steady hands. But most of all, they needed someone who understood, who knew how to look without seeing, to listen without reacting, to to know without revealing. The walls were marble, sweating with heat. Mosaics curled over ceilings like stories trapped in stone. Steam rose in thick waves, clouding vision, softening outlines. I became part of that blur. I moved like mist, wrapped in linen, silent in bare feet. There were rules, unwritten and unspoken. Never speak unless addressed. Never face the master directly. Never let your gaze meet theirs when they were unclothed. Not because it was shameful, but because power does not like being observed from below. The slaves who worked the bathhouse were like ghosts. We called each other by nicknames. No one used real names here. Too dangerous. One boy was called Ash because he tended the fires. Another was Whisper because he never said more than 2 words in a row. Me? They called me Echo because I repeated the same movements, the same nods, the same careful hand gestures, without ever revealing thought. You wouldn't have survived this because you think of cleanliness as comfort. But in the Roman bathhouse, it was performance. The masters bathed not to relax, but to display their wealth, their control, their dominance. It was here they mocked senators not present. Here they plotted against neighbors. Here they praised and humiliated their slaves in the same breath. And we were expected to hear it all and remember none of it. One day, a guest slipped. His head struck the tile. The sound rang out, sharp, wet. He didn't rise. No one moved at first. Then the steward nodded to Ash, who lifted the man's body with practiced ease. No alarm, no mourning. The guest was taken out the back. The water drained, the tile scrubbed. By nightfall, nothing remained, except the silence. I asked Whisper once if he knew the man. He just shrugged. He came in. He left, same as everyone. Then he returned to folding towels with precision only a soldier would envy. But here's what you need to understand. The bathhouse wasn't just about bodies. It was about information. Rumors were as valuable as gold. A passing insult could destroy a career. An overheard compliment could change a slave's fate, but only if you knew when to act on it, and when to pretend you hadn't heard a thing. One time I heard my own name, spoken by a merchant. "He's quiet," he said. "Knows his place. Could be useful." I never saw him again, but after that day I was watched more closely, which meant I had to move even more softly. You wouldn't have survived this, because in your world, silence feels like absence. In mine, it was presence refined to an art. In your world, walls are solid. In mine, they breathed, they listened, they remembered, and so did I. Eventually they moved me, said I had seen too much, said I was too calm. But I knew the truth. I had become part of the marble, too still to notice, too quiet to fear, but never, ever empty. By the time you no longer think about running, that's when the real chains have settled in. They're not forged of iron. They don't chafe your wrists or leave bruises on your ankles. They sit deeper, woven through your thoughts, settled like dust in the corners of your soul. You wouldn't have survived this, not because the lash would break your back, but because the silence would break your mind. There's a moment in slavery when you stop asking why, when your body moves before you command it, when the thought of rebellion doesn't even form a sentence. It becomes instinct. Wake when ordered, stand when spoken to. Lower your eyes at every voice that isn't yours, not because you're afraid, but because you've forgotten how to do anything else. I remember the day I stopped flinching. The steward raised his hand. I didn't blink, didn't move, didn't feel. And that terrified me more than any strike ever had. You wouldn't have survived this, because your sense of self is too loud. You think of freedom as a right. We thought of it as a rumor, something passed down from the old ones, spoken only in riddles. Freedom is when you can laugh without checking who's listening. That's what Tulla used to say, but even she said it quietly, as if the idea itself might echo too loudly and bring punishment. They trained us to be useful, but more than that, they trained us to be predictable. Predictability was safety. Routine was survival. I ate the same food at the same time, stood in the same spot during roll call, folded linens exactly the same way every single day. Each repetition smoothed away another edge of myself until I no longer knew if I was performing or simply existing. I once asked a fellow slave named Philo what he dreamed about. He blinked, confused, then shrugged. "Dreams?" he said. "I'm not sure I remember how." That answer has never left me. You wouldn't have survived this, because even when your body was shackled, your mind would wander. But here, the greatest cruelty was not what they did to our backs, but what they did to our thoughts. They made us distrust our own minds, made us believe that curiosity was danger, that ambition was madness, that love was weakness. I was punished once for smiling. It wasn't even a wide smile, just a small curve of the lips when I saw a bird land on the edge of the garden wall. A guard saw me, asked what I found funny. I said nothing, because what could I say? That a creature born with wings made me feel something I couldn't name? He struck me, not hard, but with purpose. And the next time I saw the bird, I looked away. Tulla once told me a story about a man who escaped. Said he ran through the hills for days, made it to the coast, even boarded a ship. But when they found him, he was kneeling, begging to return. Not because he missed Rome, but because he didn't know who he was without someone else telling him. That's what they never put in the statues or the speeches. The kind of damage that doesn't bleed. You wouldn't have survived this, because you'd try to fight too early and die too quickly. We learned to survive slowly, not by resisting, but by dissolving, by letting go of the parts of ourselves that drew attention, by learning when to vanish inside ourselves, to hide in plain sight. Some days I tried to remember my mother's voice, but the memory faded, like ink left in the sun. What I remembered more clearly was the steward's whistle, the way he snapped his fingers, the way I always turned immediately before my name was even spoken. That was my identity. Reaction. But don't mistake this for defeat, because even in the smallest part of me, a spark remained. A thought I repeated in the back of my mind like a prayer. This is not all I am. I couldn't speak it, couldn't write it, couldn't act on it. But I carried it. You wouldn't have survived this, because you would have shouted your name into the wind. We whispered ours into silence. Disobedience didn't always look like rebellion. It could be as small as a pause, a hesitation before moving, a sideways glance, a breath held a beat too long. In the empire of commands and consequences, even silence could scream. And punishment. Punishment didn't need to be loud. It just needed to linger. You wouldn't have survived this, because you'd think no was a right. For us, no was a door that led only to pain. There was no such thing as no in our world, only yes. And then, when no one was looking, quiet tears and the echo of lost dignity. I learned this early. There was a girl named Marcia. She was young, bright-eyed, always humming under her breath as she swept the hallways. One day, a guest asked her to bring wine. She hesitated, just for a second. Maybe she didn't hear, maybe she was tired, but that pause was enough. The guest raised his voice, called her insolent, said her tone was unacceptable, though she hadn't spoken a word. That night we found her outside the kitchens, kneeling, shivering. Her hands burned from the hot coals she was forced to carry bare. She didn't hum again after that, and no one mentioned her name for weeks. You wouldn't have survived this, because you've never had to weigh the price of each expression, never had to calculate if eye contact would be seen as courage or defiance. I remember the worst moment I ever had. I was told to stand guard near the master's door. Simple task. Stay still. Say nothing. But the master's son came stumbling home, drunk, demanded that I bring him water, and when I turned to go, he stopped me. I didn't say now, he slurred. I said when I feel like it. So I waited, stood in silence for nearly an hour. Then he shouted, "What are you doing still here, mutt?" I didn't answer, didn't flinch, but I was beaten anyway. Not for disobeying, but for existing in the wrong moment. You wouldn't have survived this, because your instincts would betray you. You would speak too soon, defend your pride, protect your dignity. But in Rome, dignity was a luxury only the powerful could afford. For the rest of us, survival was the art of swallowing your voice before it reached your lips. Tulla once told me a story of a slave who said no. He refused to carry a message, said it wasn't his duty. He wasn't whipped, he wasn't killed. He was sold to a mine, a place where light never reached the stone, where air came in shallow breaths, where the walls pressed in until names, memories, even pain disappeared. That was Rome's real punishment, not death, but erasure. And still some of us whispered no into our pillows at night, not loudly, not defiantly, but with hope that one day the world would hear it. I said no, once, not aloud, but in the way I looked away when the steward boasted of our obedience, in the way I tightened the sandals on a child's feet so they wouldn't blister, in the way I passed bread to the kitchen girl before the guards could notice. It was a quiet rebellion, but even that carried a price. Because you wouldn't have survived this, not for lack of strength, but because you believed that strength must roar. We believed it must endure. You wouldn't survive the auction because you believe that your worth is made of dreams, that your value comes from within. But here, your value is a number written on a wax tablet, scratched out, then rewritten again depending on who's bidding. It was dawn when they brought us out. The sun hadn't yet spilled over the rooftops, but the stone courtyard was already full of heat. Sweat ran before the day had even begun. We were arranged in lines, not by age, not by skill, but by how well we matched the expectations of the buyers. Strong boys at the front, pretty girls behind, the sick and the scarred, further back, behind a screen. You wouldn't survive this because you'd try to speak, but they didn't want to hear your voice. They wanted your height, your weight, your ability to bear pain without flinching. The man beside me was shaking. His name was Cato. He had once been a cook in a noble house, but now he stood half naked, hands bound, his eyes darting between the crowd. "They'll break us up," he whispered. "I know it." He was right. His daughter, just 12, was taken by a man who wore too many rings. Cato cried out just once, and for that, he was struck. Not by the buyer, by the auctioneer. Emotion delayed sales. Emotion was bad for business. The platform was slick with sweat and fear. The auctioneer called out names like they were ingredients at a market stall. 200 denarii for this one. Healthy teeth. Can carry timber. Look at those shoulders. I tried not to listen, but every word lodged itself in my skull like gravel in a wound. When my turn came, they shoved me into the light. I blinked. Not at the sun, at the silence. That heavy, evaluating quiet as men looked me over like a wine jug, tapping, tilting, inspecting for cracks. A woman raised her hand. A merchant, judging by the stain of coin on her fingertips. She asked if I could read. The auctioneer laughed. "No need," he said. "He won't need letters where he's going." The crowd chuckled. I stood still, not because I was brave, because I had forgotten how to tremble. You wouldn't survive this, because you would think someone should protest. Someone should say, "This isn't right." But this was Rome. And in Rome, silence was not complicity. It was law. After the bidding ended, they branded us. A simple mark, just above the hip. An iron pressed against flesh until the scream curled into the throat and died. I didn't scream, not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew that silence was the only power left to me. Later they handed me a tunic, gray and coarse, no name stitched inside, no ownership of my own body, just linen and the mark. Cato was gone. His daughter vanished into the crowd. I never saw them again, but I never forgot his voice. That single whisper, like a thread stretched too tight, ready to snap. You wouldn't survive this, because you believe beginnings are beautiful. That being chosen is a gift. But here, a new beginning was just another name for ownership. You wouldn't survive as a Roman slave. Not because of the whips, not because of the hunger, not even because of the auction block, but because you still believe they can take everything. And that's the final illusion, because even in Rome, even in the belly of the machine, there were things they couldn't touch. I remember one evening, the sky was gray with summer dust, and I had just finished cleaning the fountain stones. The courtyard was silent. For a moment, no orders, no lashes, no footsteps, only birds, only wind in the fig leaves. I sat. Not long, maybe just a minute, but it was mine. That moment wasn't stolen, it wasn't assigned, it wasn't earned through obedience. It just was, and it was enough. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd expect freedom to arrive in a grand speech. You'd wait for armies, for uprisings, for flaming banners. But for us, freedom came in moments. The glance of another slave across the hall, the stolen crust of bread passed behind a column, the whisper of your real name, breathed once in the darks, before returning to silence. I knew a boy who carved animals from olive wood, tiny things. He used a spoon he'd stolen from the kitchen to scrape the shapes. He kept them buried under a loose stone near the well, said they reminded him of his village. One day, a guard found them, smashed them to pieces, laughed, but the boy just shrugged. "I still remember the shapes," he said, and that memory, the shape in his mind, they couldn't break it. You wouldn't survive this, because you think freedom means escape. For us, it meant endurance, surviving the slow erosion of the self, without vanishing completely. I grew older. Wrinkles came before wisdom, but they came, and eventually I was given lighter duties, trusted with errands beyond the gate, sent to the market without a chain. They thought it meant I'd been broken, that I'd learned my place. But I knew the truth. I had learned to carry freedom where they couldn't see it, in my gait, in my stories, in the silence I had mastered. You wouldn't survive this, not because you are weak, but because you are still whole, and they would try every day to carve pieces out of you. But we survived by letting them take only the surface, by hiding the rest where they could never reach. The greatest rebellion isn't escape, it's memory. It's holding on to who you are when every hour tells you to forget. It's seeing yourself, not through their eyes, but through the eyes of who you used to be before the collar, before the silence. I am old now. They say the empire is fading, that new masters are coming, new names, new chains. But I am already free, because I never gave them everything, because there was always something they couldn't brand or sell or command. You wouldn't survive this, but maybe, just maybe, you'd learn what survival really means, not living without chains, but knowing how to live even with them. And one day, when no one's watching, when the sun breaks just right through the trees, you'd sit quietly in the dust, take a deep breath, and remember, you are not theirs.